나소다 데네 송주 신신한게 에
Today, I would like to wish all of you who are listening to this teaching my warm greetings, and in particular, on the community of the Sangha at the monasteries in India, Nepal, and Bhutan, all the friends from Dharma centers, and everyone else who's watching over the internet. I wish to offer you my greetings. So from today, for the next 4 days, I will be speaking about matters related to Buddhism. Actually, this teaching this year is supposed to be connected with the origin of the secret mantra, but I've taken this opportunity to speak about the history of India, and within that, speak about the history of Buddhism. So I thought I would like to take this opportunity to give you an introduction to all of this. So, over the previous days, we've spoken primarily about Indian history in general and the origins of the Brahmanical religions. And so from today, I will begin giving the introduction to Buddhism.
다 상기 좀 되는 전백이 뒤즈이 버지다 마시
Now I will speak about the dates of when the Buddha appeared in detail later, but it probably was in the end of the 6th century BCE. So at the end of the 6th century BCE. And so that's the period when the Buddha was born. And because of his birth, there was a great change in the religions of India. Before the birth of the Buddha, India had a great deal of freedom and a great tradition of upholding the tradition of the Upanishads and of investigating the Upanishads. There were even many women. There were also many women who became very learned. However, at the most time, people just wanted to use intellectual or sophist logic and wanted to become well known through that. So they held a lot of debates amongst themselves, and in doing these debates, in the end, most of them ended up having the bad views or deceptive vows. So once they're debating, they all end up in similar positions. So they being about the same. So they started involving trickery, and so there were many people who had these deceptive, wrong views. No, even the people at that time, there were also a few people who actually investigated the fundamental questions of philosophy during that period. But most of the people, so there were just no matter how many people there were who really investigated the investigation of the actual meaning, most of the people who upheld the Brahmanical traditions began to cling to the external aspects of the tradition. They only thought about the early aspects of the tradition were important. And so most people of all levels of society continued to view this old decaying tradition the same way as, like we have the Tibetan expression, looking at your father's cup as being important. It's like So that when you have the father's cup, it might be a beat up old cup, but you think it's important because it's your father. There's no other reason to consider it important except that it's your father's cup. And so it's similar to that. So there's an old tradition that was a little bit battered and didn't have much meaning anymore, but they still considered it to be extremely important. And so for these reasons, many people in the beginning, they had a really strong intensity of faith. But gradually, even the old traditions, as they became sort of pointless and pointless, then the people's faith also declined. And as if people lost their faith. And also many people were turned off by all the people who were too involved in the external aspects of the tradition. And so the hopes that what people began to hope for was to find a new, more vibrant, living religion. And so people had a new hope, the hope to encounter a new religion, and that there might be a new religion. And so they began to have this hope. And the reason for this is that the old religion had become, had decayed, and it had primarily become an external tradition. People were turned off by this. And they wanted to not nearly. And so those people who didn't want to just cling to an external form, but who wanted to actually practice the inner meaning, had the thought of hoping that there might be some sort of a new tradition, a vibrant tradition. Now, an even worse situation was that the Brahmas became more and more audacious. They got more and more audacious, and they had the power, right? In religious terms, they had a lot of power. So they were considered like gods at that time, right? And so they used their power for anything. And so this gave many difficulties. Also, there was the tradition of the caste system. No, there was never really much reason for it. However, the people had worked hard to entrench the caste system, and so for that reason, the Brahman's power grew, and legally it grew. Before, it had just been merely oral. Now it's actually written down in laws, and so the Brahman's power is growing stronger and stronger. And so for this reason, the way they acted toward the Shudra caste, the lowest of the fourth castes, was even more cruel than before. So they treated them even worse than before and suppressed them even more. And so for that reason, many people thought, well, the Brahmas had become symbols of people with no education or skills, whose thirst would not be quenched by drinking an ocean, or whose hunger would not be sated by eating in a mountain. So they became like a symbol of this. And so they saw that the Brahmins were like that type of a person. But now the Shudra, the lowest caste, were in the completely opposite situation of the Brahmas, a different situation than the Brahmins. They were not respected at all in society. They were not valued. So this is the type of people that they had become. Now, generally, the Shudra at the time was actually, in contrast before, was a little bit more broader at that time. And they also, the Shudra also made a great contribution to the development of the society, and actually had become a integral segment of society. They had a great impact on society, but they were not treated well. They were, but they were indispensable for society because they did all the work that no one else would do. So they were treated poorly and not respected. However, in terms of what we speak about in terms of religious affairs or how their legal rights, the situation for the Shudra did not improve. Just as before, they were oppressed in an even more cruel way than before. And so they were always treated badly. And so there's in that society with no equality and that unequal social system with such traditions, our Buddha, he was someone with great loving kindness and compassion. He had a great, really profound feeling, seeing the pointless situation of society and seeing all the disrespect and oppression of the Shudras. He saw that the Shudra were in a very bad situation, and the Brahmins were abusing their power. And so he felt great. He had a very strong feeling in his heart. He also surveyed all of the religions and philosophies of India at that time. And all those religions and philosophies of that time he looked to see whether they're actually really meaningful or beneficial religions, if they had actually beneficial ideas. He considered this very deeply. Likewise, he taught that whether someone was Brahmin or someone was Shudra, the low caste, he taught that they're all no different, being able to eliminate the stains in their being and achieve liberation. Everyone had the same rights or the same capacity to achieve liberation. And so in this way, he opened the gateway to Buddhism to everyone. He said everyone could practice. He welcomed everyone. Likewise, in Buddhism, loving kindness and compassion are important. And he taught this very strongly. And so these two, and so it's like that, and the hopes of the people at that time fit well together. It's like holding your two hands together. So it's like the people's hopes and the Buddhist teachings really matched each other. And so for that reason, many people came together as a community and became Buddhist. And in particular, those from the Vaishya and the Shudra castes received very warm welcomes in Buddhism. In addition, there were many in the Kshatriya caste, many kings who also took refuge in Buddhism. So for that reason, Buddhism was kind of like a tiger that had grown wings, or if we speak the Tibetan way. It's sort of like a great Garuda bird flying into the sky. And so it didn't take very long, no more than a century or two, for Buddhism to become the largest religion in the world, the one with the most adherents. And so I think that saying this is would not be improper. So the Buddhism at that time so this is why it is important for us to understand what this history of the Buddhism is and the background of the story of Buddhism is. And so this helps us understand why is it that people would criticize Buddhism or object to Buddhism. This comes down to the social situation at the time. Now, next, I would like to give a brief account of the Buddha's life. So if when giving a brief account of the Buddha's life, first of all, I'd like to show, I thought it'd be good to show you all this first. The first thing you need to know is, what is the Buddha's family line? And if you ask that, then the Buddha is in the Shaka peoples, and his clan is the Gautama family. And the meaning of the word Gautama is like the supreme bull. So if you speak about it, so it basically means in colloquial, it's like it's the best cattle. So they considered cows and cattle to be brutal, and their best bull. So like the leader of the greatest of the bulls is probably called the greatest of the bulls, the supreme bull, or the Gautama. So they called him. That's how we should understand this. Now we also understand the Siddhartha, or the Prince Siddhartha. Now his father's name was King Shuddhasana. His mother's name was Maya. His aunt's name was Prajapati. Now I'll introduce her later. So Prajapati is later a very important figure. The place he was born was in Lumbini, and the place where he lived was in Kapilavastu. So that was that. So before I gave the introduction to the Buddha's life, I thought I'd give you an introduction to this list of the characters of the people in the Buddha's life. Now, as I don't really need to say to all of you, the founder of the Buddhist religion was the Buddha, and the Buddha and all of the philosophies and histories of Buddha agree that he is in unison. Now, the followers of the other Indus religions and philosophies call his followers by the name of Buddhists. It's probably that's it. So these days we say Buddhism, right? That's English, right? But it's something like Buddha, Buddhanta, or something like that in Sanskrit. And now what we usually say in Tibetan is insider Buddhists, or Nangpa. So we have that word Nangpa, or insider. Now this is a word, this word insider, and Nangpa is a name that we, within Buddhists, we give to ourselves. We say, I am an insider. And since the other followers of other religions are outside that, so they're called outsiders. So sometimes when I speak about Buddhism, I'm going to say Nangpa, or insider, and sometimes I'll say Buddhism. I'm going to use either of them, but so whether you say Nangpa, or insider, or Sangyepa in Tibetan, it both means Buddhist. Now, the word Buddha these days in the entire world has become like a special Buddhist word. But actually, if you look at it, the word Buddha was used not only by the Buddhists. Yesterday, there was the Jain religion that I introduced. The Jain religion. So we call the Jain... The Jains also use the word Buddha. And they say that there are 45 sages or 45 rishis, and they call all of them Buddhas. So they say that they're all Buddhas. They say that they will not take rebirth. They will not be reborn in existence. Likewise, we also call the Buddha the Muni, or the Bhagavan, right? We also call them the Bhagavan. So in Tibetan, that would be Chomdende. In English, we use the word Bhagavan, the Sanskrit word. We also call the Arhat. And all of these words are used by the Buddhas, and they're also used in the Jain religion. The Jains use all of these words. However, Now, the founder of the Jain religion was named Mahavira, right? And so if we translate that into English, that'd be like the great hero. And so they called their founder, their teacher, by the name of Jinnah or Victor. So they commonly called him the Jinnah. And because they called him Jinnah, their religion was called the Jain. Jain. The reason why it's a Jain is because they called their founder the Jinnah. And they followed him, so they're called the Jain, or the people of the Jinnah. No, among us Buddhists, we do use the word Jinnah or victor for the Buddha, especially in the Mahayana. There's even more, it's used more frequently in the Mahayana. But he was called the Buddha. And so for that reason, the religion is called by the name of the Buddha. It's called Buddhism. No, generally, we Buddhists assert that there are many Buddhas, such as the Buddhas of the three times, that those of the past and the future. We say there are many Buddhas. But the one who is accepted as the teacher or the founder of Buddhism is generally said to be the Buddha Shakyamuni. And so this name, Buddha Shakyamuni, is like an individual name of the Buddha of our period. And so I think it's fine to say that. Now, there are, of course, other Buddhas who had very similar names, as Shakyamuni or the great Shakyamuni. But we can also say that it's also, if you say that it's also the special name for the particular name of the Buddha Shakyamuni, then I think there's nothing wrong with saying that. Now, the reason why it's called the Shakyamuni is because he was the greatest being, or the great born in the Shakya ethnic group. He was called by that name of Shakyamuni. So the Buddha was born in the Shakya ethnic group, and his clan within the Shakya ethnic group is called the Gautama. So many Westerners call Buddha the Buddha by the name Gautama Buddha. And Gautama is the name of his clan, and Buddha is the name he's well known by. And so they call him the Gautama Buddha. But within the northern tradition, or the northern traditions, or in Buddha tradition, we call him the Buddha Shakyamuni. We don't call him the Gautama Buddha. So he was born within the Shakya ethnic group. And so who is that Shakya group? The Shakyas at that time, where did they live at that time? First, if I show you this map. So where is it, if you ask? So in terms of present day geography, it's around the border between Nepal and India. So there were a small group of people. So there's a small tribe, a small ethnic group, a small number of people. And the name of the capital was called, their capital was called Kapilavastu. So in Tibetan, this is said Sergyedrong. So it's Kapilavastu. So Kapilavastu was here. This is Kapilavastu. That is Kapilavastu. Now, the reason why it is called Kapilavastu, and the reason why they're called the Shakya, there are many different explanations of these terms. However, one of the most important famous Indian poets, one of the most famous Buddhist masters is a Buddhist master named Ashvaghosha, and he wrote a work called the poem of Sandarananda. And so this is named after the Buddha's younger brother Nanda. And so this is a long poem. And what it says in there is that the Shakyas were descendants of King Ikshvaku. So first there was a father who had many sons, and there was a kind of the ministers fomented a dispute, and so he had to send all of his sons off into a forest. Now, when they talked, and when they sent him to the forest, now this forest had many shaka or teal trees. Now, I've looked for the name of this. There's an ishaka tree, and I haven't found it. Now, this shaka tree that was plentiful in the forest that they were staying in. Now, all of his sons and daughters had spent such a long time in that forest that they were given the name Shakya, because they spent such a long time in a forest of shaka trees that they were called by the name Shakya. It also says in this poem that the reason why their town was called Kapilavastu is that this is where the sage Kapila, probably the one who was the teacher or founder of the Sankhya tradition. So the place where he stayed was the place where he stayed. And the Shakyas there became his students. They became the students of Kapila, and so after Kapila passed away, they named their town after him, and they called it by the name Kapilavastu. At any time, at the time of the Buddha, who was the leader of Kapilavastu was King Shuddhodana. He was the king's father, right? He was the Buddha's father, right? And then nearby there was another town, and that was called the town of Devadaha. Now the leader of Devadahu was Shakyasuppa Buddha, and so that was his name. So this is a town called Devadaha or Ramagrama. Now these two were related, and so they also they got along very well. Now, generally, in the Shakyas, among the Shakyan people, their leaders or their kings were chosen according to their age and the qualities. And then within that, they picked someone, and they'd serve as kings in turn. So, in general, the Shakyans of that time had a political independence. They had power over all of their internal affairs. But were they completely independent kingdom? They were not. They were not able to be a completely independent kingdom because at that time in northern India, there was a really powerful kingdom, and that kingdom was called Kosala. So this is called Kosala. This is a very powerful kingdom. They had no choice but to become like a vassal state of that. So where is Kosala at that time? So here is Kosala. So this is the kingdom of Kosala. So this is such a very powerful kingdom, and they're very near it. And so they had no choice but to become a vassal state of the Shakyans. But if we think about it from one perspective, the Shakyans had a lot of freedom on their own, and they were also very prosperous. They're also high caste, and they were prosperous. And so even within the Kosala, the Shakyas were the most prosperous people. Now, at that time, in Kosala, the king of Kosala was named Prasenajit. And And the capital, his capital city, Pasenij's capital city was Shravasti. And so he lived in the region of Shravasti. Now, King Prasejana was a very skillful king. So for that reason, the region that he ruled over carried a very, very large area. So as if like the lands of the Shaka peoples were like almost entirely encircled by Kosala. Now, to the south of the kingdom of Kosala, there was another powerful kingdom. Now, what was that kingdom? It's this. That's right, Magadha. So to the south of this powerful kingdom to the south of Kosala was called Magadha. Now, the king of Magadha at that time was Bimbisara. And so to the capital of Magadha, Bimbisara's capital was Rajagriha. So he lived in the area of Rajagriha. And then to the east of the kingdom of to the east of the region of Magadha is a kingdom called Anga. So the capital of this is called Champaka. And so the king of Anga ruled from Champaka. Now, there are many other smaller, minor kingdoms, but I don't need to introduce all of them. Perhaps in the next few days, if I have time, I can introduce them to you, but I think that's enough about them for today. So now I thought I'd like to give a little bit of an introduction to like the family tree of the Buddha. So as I said before, the Buddha's ethnic group among the four castes at that time, there were the four castes in India, right? Among the four castes, so what caste was it included in? It's possible that he was probably Kshatriya. It's possible, but it's not definite. And the reason why it's not definite is that from one angle, even within the Shakya people, there's probably no distinction of the four castes. Among the Shakyas themselves, they didn't make distinctions between Brahmins and Kshatriya and so forth. Likewise, the Shakya people were primarily all farmers. And the crop they primarily produced was rice. And so for this reason, if we say that they're Kshatriyas, then it's not right to say that because the Kshatriyas did not practice farming. And so this is one reason to suspect that. And so then you wonder, well, were the Shakya people, were they an Aryan people? That's not true. Not necessarily true. Then are they were they an Asian ethnic group? They are not. If you need to say, where did the Shakya ethnic group come from? It's difficult to actually say. These days, researchers have researched a great deal into where the Shakya ethnic group came from, but they haven't been able to decide it. It's a very complicated matter, so I don't need to speak about it today. But in any case, the Shakya said that they're, say, from the descendants of King Ikshvaku. And since they're descendants of Ikshvaku, so yesterday I spoke about the Surya Vamsha and the Soma Vamsha. So they're included in the Surya Vamsha, the clan of the sun. And so when you talk about the Soma Vamsha and the Surya Vamsha, the sun and moon clans, these are very important family lineages within India. So there's a high class that everyone respected in India at that time. So what is like the family tree of the Shakyas? If we think about the family lineage of the Shakyas, there are only disagreements amongst all. There's no agreement at all. But to speak of it in general, I think it's beneficial. So basically, I'm going to base this on the Abhinishkrama Sutra, which is in Tibetan. Now, there's also a similar sutra of the same title in Tibetan, but I'm not certain if it is the same. But the one that I'm going to give this induction based upon is the one that is in Chinese. And within that sutra, they speak about the family lineage of the Buddha. And so I'm going to introduce the Buddha's family tree according to the Chinese version of the Abhinishkrama Sutra. Likewise, also the great scholar named Rhys Davids. He was probably over 100 years ago, but he was a scholar from that time in the West. So I'm going to take the Abhinishkrama Sutra as the basis and fill in the blanks according to the research done by the scholar Rhys Davids. So first of all, I'd like to show you this. So this is it. So what should I say? So there's the King Jayasena. He had a son named Simhahana and a daughter named Yashodhara. So Simhahanu had 4 sons and 1 daughter. Among these 4 saints, the first of these is Shuddhodana. So the Shuddhodana is Buddha's father, King Shuddhodana. And so Shuddhodana had 2 sons. The older was Siddhartha, that was the Buddha, and the younger was named Nanda. So Nanda was the Buddha's younger brother. He was a half brother. They had the same father, but a different mother. Now, after Shuddhodana, the second brother was named Shuklodana. And he had 2 sons named Nandaka and Bhadraka, who both later became monks. And then there was Jose, Dronadana, who had 2 sons, Ananda and Devadatta. Now, there are 2 different Devadatas, actually, because there's a Devadatta. It's understood to mean a Devadatta who was a Buddha student, and it also is understood as the Devadatta who appeared as the opponent of the Buddha. So what they say in the Theravada tradition is that Devadatta was a Devadatta from the city. Devadatta from the city of Devadatta. So he was like an uncle of the Buddha. But in the northern Buddha tradition and in the Chinese tradition, Devadatta Devadatta is the one who was the opponent of the Buddha, the Buddha's rival. No, but there's some debate over who the father was, whether it was Dronadana or Shuddhodana, or another of the brothers. Then there was Amritadana, who had 2 sons, Aniruddha and Mahanama. And then there's the daughter named Amrita. So she was the younger sister of the 4 sons. And she had a son named Tishya. So the son or daughter named Tishya. So this is what happened. It can be it's very complicated. So maybe I'll just leave it there. It's so complicated. So when we reconvene, I will give you an introduction. It's a little bit complicated, so I will give you an introduction once we return after the break. Now, when I show you this Shaka family tree, maybe it's easier to explain it like this. Jayasena, this is a Prince Siddhartha, right? And so these are Siddhartha and his cousins. And this is the father, Shuddhodana, and his generation. So this is the generation of King Shuddhodana, the generation of fathers, but the Buddha's father. And then the king Simhasanu is the father of the Buddha's father, Shuddhodana. So he's the father of the Buddha's father. And then Jayasena is Simhahanu's father. So he was the king. So Jayasena was the king of Kapilavastu, and he had two children, the son Simhamanu and the daughter Yashodhara, the same name as the Buddha's wife, but there's a different person. So they were brother and sister. So King Simhahanu had, how many sons did he have? He had 4 sons. So these are the 4, and then 1 daughter named Amrita. So there were 5 siblings. Now each of the 5 siblings had their own sons, and so Shuddhodana had 2 sons. So the elder son was Siddhartha, that's the Buddha, and the younger one was Nagawa, was named Nanda. And so in this way, Shuddhodana's brothers also had their own children. And we also have Yashodhara. This is there's a younger sister of King Simhahanu. So Yashodhara there was another city called Devadaha, and so she married into the royal family of Devadaha, and Yashodhara had 1 son and 2 daughters. The one son was called the Shakya Suprabuddha. So the one of these was Maya, and the other was Prajapati. No, so there's the 3 children. One of them was Shakya Suprabuddha, and he also had 1 son and a daughter. And so his son was named Devadatta. And so when I said that there are 2 Devadatas, that is the reason why. So one Devadatta was the son of the ruler of the city of Devadaha, the Shakya Suprabuddha, and his daughter was called Yashodhara. So she was the second Yashodhara, and the second Yashodhara. So the Buddha, when he was young, was called Siddhartha. So she was married to the Yashodhara, the daughter of the earlier Yashodhara. So this is basically, to explain in brief, this is how it happens. Now, if I explain it in detail, it's very complicated, but I don't need to speak about that all. So what some sutras say is that Maya and Mahaprajita are both Suprabhudi's daughters. Suprabhudi, as I said, so Yashodhara, and so in another sutra, they are said to be Suprabhudi's daughter. Likewise, the king. And now explained that she was now explained that the Buddha's wife Yashodhara was the daughter of Suprabhuti. But others said that he is the daughter of a minister named Shakyanama. And so there are many different explanations, but we don't have time to speak about them all right now. So in brief, the most important is that the Buddha's father's name is that something we have to remember. His father's name is Shuddhadana. So he was Shuddhadana, and at that time he was the ruler or the king of the Shakyan ethnic group. And his mother was named Mahamaya, or Maya. She's called Mahamaya. This is the mother of the Buddha. However, but the mother's Buddha died 7 days after the Buddha was born. You've probably all heard this. 7 days after the Buddha was born, his mother passed away. And when she passed away, the Buddhists would ask, what is the reason why she passed away? And there are many different explanations of that. Now, among the different explanations, to give a representative one way of explaining is that there's a reason why the Buddha's mother passed away. The reason is that the Buddha's mother had continued to live so later the Buddha would leave and renounce the kingdom and go off and go through ascendings. Now, if his mother had seen it, then the mother would have such love for her son that there would be a danger that she would have had a heart attack. And so that is the reason why she passed away, they say. This is a kind of nice little explanation, isn't it? But this is only an explanation given by later people. But if I look at it, and this is just my own thought, my own opinion, the time when the Buddha was born, at that time, King Shuddhadana was very, very young. And Mahamaya was also very old. Excuse me, King Shuddhadana was very old, and so Mahamaya was also very old. And so even these days, when you have when you're older, if you have children, it's a great danger, even in the modern age. So in those days, there was not similar health circumstances that we have these days. So after she gave birth, she had some health problem, and because of that, she passed away, I think. That's what I think. But that's just my opinion. But I don't have any text or any manuscript as a source for this. So in brief, 7 days after the Buddha passed away, 7 days after the Buddha was born, his mother was passed away. And so he also had his aunt. So there was also Prajapati. And so she was the second queen of King Shuddhadana. And so she adopted him and raised the Buddha. Now, as I mentioned before, that the Buddha had a half-brother named Nanda, right? So now when we speak about the life story of the Buddha, that I've already explained. So first, when the Buddha entered the womb, his mother had an extraordinary dream of a white elephant dissolving into her body. And this is what it is said, right? So that is called the deed of entering the womb. Now, just before the Buddha was born, so shortly before he was to be born, his mother Maya developed the wish to return to her homeland of Devadaha. And so while she was traveling back to Devadaha, she came to the grove of Lumbini. It's like a garden or a park. And when she arrived at this place called Lumbini, so before she arrived at her homeland, so the Mahayana arrived at the site of Lumbini and gave birth to the Buddha. Now, as when we say that the Buddha was born out of his mother's right side, we say that, right? He came out from between her ribs, right? So now this saying that she was born out of the right side of his mother is probably from an old Indian tradition. It's saying that the Brahmas came out of Brahma came out of the top of the Brahma's head, and the other caste came from the shoulders, and so forth. So I think this is basically a traditional way of speaking in India. It's just kind of a way of saying that the Kshatriya caste were important, and so it's a way of speaking about their births. But I think that actually he was probably born the way children normally are born. If she came out between her ribs, that'd be kind of strange and really quite frightening, wouldn't it? So so the Buddha was born at Lumbini, is a place where later the Emperor Ashoka came, and he erected a temple and a pillar there. And this was described by the Chinese master Xuanzang, who saw it when he traveled to India. And he recorded this in his account of his travels to India. Then in 1896, some archaeologists excavated the site, and they found Ashoka's pillar underground. And when they read the inscription on the pillar, they determined that this site had been the Buddha's birthplace. So the name of the area now is something like Rumindei. That's what it's called these days. It's probably Nepali, and I don't know it very well. It's better not to try. It's probably some language from the Tarai. Now, after the Buddha was born, the name he was given when he was a child, he wasn't originally called the Buddha, right? He was called the Buddha after he achieved Buddhahood. So when he was young, he was called Siddhartha. The reason he was called Siddhartha is that at that time, at the same time that the child Siddhartha was born, many different desired aims happened all at the same time. For example, the king found some treasure, and there were several other children born in the Shakya people. So at that time, so for that reason, all of his aims had been accomplished. So they called him the name of Siddhartha, or the accomplishment of all aims, and so called him Siddhartha. Now we have a very big question, and the question is, when was the Buddha born? When was the Buddha born? What year? What month? What day was he born on? So now the answer is you can take your choice. Forget about saying what month or what day. You can't even say what year he was born in. There are only disagreeing positions. There's not even no harmony at all among the different assertions. So it's very difficult to say definitely that the Buddha was born on a particular day. But in the next day or two, I'm going to spend an entire day speaking only about the dates of the Buddha, the date of his birth and the date that he passed into nirvana. It's very complicated, so I'm going to devote an entire day to it, and I will speak about it later. Now, in the 6th century, there was an Indian master named Gyanagupta who traveled to China. And he translated the Abhinishkrama Sutra into Chinese. And this is the same sutra as I mentioned before, the Abhinishkrama Sutra, which was translated by an Indian master into Chinese when he had gone to Chinese. Now, what it says in this sutra, and this is a very early sutra, and so that is why I'm using it as my source. Now, before he reached the age of age, Prince Siddhartha was allowed to play. He's given a lot of freedom, and he just spent his time enjoying himself. So he did not need to study yet, and he only spent his time playing. Now, when he reached the age of 8, he then began his schooling. And when he began his schooling, what did he have to study? Learning to read, learning to write. And likewise, he also learned athletic skills or military skills. For example, this. Oh, I forgot to talk about this. There is the examination of the baby by the soothsayers. This is when you're looking at the astrologers. So after that, he began his education. He spent 4 years studying the education, and he spent 4 years learning, and achieved mastery in all those areas of knowledge. So now, as I forgot to say before, in the old tradition, they would examine the face and all the different marks and signs on the baby's body, and they'd say, now in the future, what is going to happen with this child? And so they invited people who are skilled soothsayers to examine the child's face and features and body. And what they said at that time is that your son is that in the future, perhaps he's going to become a universal emperor. So universal emperor means basically at that time, means someone who would be able to gain control over all of India, a very powerful and great king. Or perhaps you'll go forth as a monastic and become someone who has really great knowledge, who realizes the knowledge should become this sort of a great being. So they say either one of these two. And so now King Shuddhadana thought to himself, no, if he becomes like a universal emperor, like this is what I want, this is what I'm his father, and so I think that'd be a bit great. No, if he goes forth, and then that wouldn't work. He was worried about that happening. He only had one older son, right? And if that were to go off and become a monk, then he had the difficulty of no one to take over his kingdom, right? So from one perspective, he had a faith, and from another aspect, he had the worry. And so this is why he was so careful to take care of the Buddha. Now, when the Prince Siddhartha had become very learned in all the areas of knowledge and athletic skills and so forth, so they went to and all the gathered with all of the Shakyus in this park to go, and they all went to practice archery. And when they're playing with the archer, and at that time there was a bird flying in the sky. Some people say it was a crane, some say it was a goose. Whether it was a crane or a goose is hard to say. In any case, there was a large bird that was flying into the sky, and at that point, there was Devadatta, right? The one who later called the demon Devadatta would later become. But at that point, he was not yet the demon. But this was when Devadatta was young. And he saw this bird flying in the sky, and he thought, and he had been practicing archery and so that today I'm gonna show off to everyone these days. And he shot the arrow, and he shot, and it hit the bird, and the bird fell to the ground. And when the place where it fell to the ground was actually right in front of the Prince Siddhartha. So Prince Siddhartha saw the bird fall, and he took the bird in his arms, and he started to rub it. And he pulled out the arrow that had struck the bird, and he treated the wound with honey and so forth. And while he was treating, then Devadatta sent a person, he said, to say, I shot a bird with an arrow, and he fell by you. So please give me back that bird. It's not it wouldn't be right for you to keep it, Devadatta said. And so the Prince Siddhartha sent the person back to give him the message. If this bird dies, then I'll give it to you, of course. But if it does not, I won't give it to you, he said. And we said this, then Devadatta sent the person back again. And the person said, whether it dies or not, you have to give it to me. You absolutely have to give it to me. And the reason is that I'm the one who shot it first, right? I'm the one who shot it first, and it's because of my arrow that it fell to the ground. So how can you keep it? Why won't you give it back to me? You absolutely have to give it back to me, he said. And when he said that, then Siddhartha said, in the past, I've already made an aspiration to protect all sentient beings. And because I've made that prayer, and so this bird is one of all sentient beings, and so I absolutely have to protect it. He said, I'm going to protect it. So Devadatta and Siddhartha then got an argument over the bird. And in the end, all the Shakya elders had to convene a meeting and to think, what can we do about this? What should we do about the situation, they asked. So they had the meeting and they had to resolve the dispute. So for that reason, so the disputes between Devadatta and Siddhartha continued for the entire life, and the first event in that disagreement began with that because of the killing of the bird. So that's the event that caused a lifelong rivalry. And so from then on, Devadatta only just caused problems for the Buddha, right? Now, one time, King Shuddhadana went out, taking many people with him. He was going out to survey the fields because the Shakyas were primarily farmers, right? So he primarily, as the king of the Shakyas, he wanted to go to take a look at the crops in the fields. And he also took the Prince Siddhartha with him. And he saw how the animals were suffering in the fields, and how he saw the stronger animals would eat the weaker ones. He saw how all of the farmers in the fields were always bent over and working extremely hard. It's like they're all just seeing how hard they're sweating. And so he felt a great world weariness at this point, very despondent. And he was very unhappy to see this. And so instead of staying with a group of people and watching the festival, the shows, he withdrew from the crowds. He went sat under a tree, and he sat underneath that, and he did underneath the tree, and he did some meditation. So the Buddha himself, from the time he was very young, enjoyed doing meditation. Just naturally, instinctively, he enjoyed doing meditation. So when he sat underneath this tree and did meditation, the meditation he did at that point was actually he achieved the first level, the first jhana. That's what it said. He achieved the level, the first jhana. This is because of the previous births. It's not like you sat down and achieved the level of the first jhana. It wouldn't immediately happen. But what it says in the sutras is that at that time, he felt despondent. He sat underneath the trees, and when he sat there, he achieved the level of the first jhana, it said. Now, as he grew older and older, then when the Prince Siddhartha got to the age of 16, King Shuddhadana recognized Prince Siddhartha as the crown prince. He gave him this position of being the crown prince. And he had him marry the Shakya princess Yashodhara. So this is the picture of him marrying Yashodhara. Now he and Yashodhara had one son, and his name was Rahula. Now also one time, when all the Shakya people gathered, Prince Adanta displayed his athletic prowess. So he showed his martial arts, kind of like the kung fu. He had been spending time studying martial arts from the time he was young, and so when all the Shakyas got together, he displayed his prowess, and he amazed all of the Shakyas with his display of his skills. Now, the time when there are different positions as to when this happened. Some people say that before he got married, he displayed his athletic prowess, and some say that it was after he had gotten married. Now, this is primarily a difference between the scriptures of the northern tradition and the southern tradition. According to the northern tradition, it says that before he got married, in order to have a competition to see who would become Yashodhara's husband, they had this athletic competition. And so there's a little bit of difference over that. In any case, for the Kshatriya class, it's very important to show off their martial skills, because the people in the Kshatriya class have to go off to war, right? So in the old days, if you're going to go to war, you had to have martial skills. It's not like these days where it's not like today where our enemy may be far away, kilometers away, and just shoot them like that and kill them, right? You had to go fight hand to hand, and so you had to have your own strength and skills to practice. And so for that reason, Kshatriyas considered studying martial skills very important. In particular, the Shakyas were very skilled in archery. And in that time, there was no one who could rival the Shakyas in their skills in archery. So basically, in India, at that time, the Shakyas were the most skilled in archery. And so basically, so at that time, the Buddha Shakyamuni showed off his skills, particularly in archery, and became very well known for this. Now, after he got married, he left 10 years later. He decided to leave the palace and to wander as a mendicant, or to go to practice the Dharma. Now, the reason why he decided to do this was the main. And so, like as it says in our praise of the Buddha's deeds, or it says showing world weariness at the gates of the city. So when he left so on occasions when he went out from the city, he saw an old man, an ill man, the corpse of a person, and a monk. And when he saw them, then he developed a great desire to go forth. He thought, I have to go forth. There's no point to human life. Human life is important, and he thought. So this really strong feeling for this in his heart, and so for that he just completely decided he was going to go forth. In any case, he was still young when he decided to go forth, but his parents, now his actual mother was not there, but his father, the king, and Prajapati wanted him to continue holding power as the king. But he gave up on that. I mean, he still already had a wife and a son, but he also gave them up, and he left the city of Kapilavastu. Now, the way he left is that one way of explaining is that in the middle of the night, probably like around 1 or 2 in the morning, right? So he had a horse named Kantaka, this horse whom he really liked, and the horse's name was called Kantaka. And he rode the horse. So he left the horse and he went with his charioteer Chana, and with those two, he left Kapilavastu without anyone knowing. So at that time, how old was he? Now, there are also many different positions. Some people say that he was 31. Some people say 29. So there are differences. There are 3 different positions. But 29 is the age that most people accept in general these days. So at the age of 29, he decided to go forth and become a monk. And in the night, he fled the palace. He had no choice but to flee. If he had said this to the king would have let him, right? And this Prince Siddhartha's act or deed of fleeing the palace was taken as example, but was considered important by many later practitioners. They took it as an example, and they thought that going forth means like you have to flee the house like Prince Siddhartha. It's not they don't think about whether they have renunciation with the Buddha, but they think, oh, we have to go forth. We have to go forth like the Buddha Shakyamuni did. We have to leave the home. And so then people take this as an example and then just leave the house all of a sudden. So after the prince had left the house, he then cut his hair and went forth. He put on the robes of a mendicant, and he practiced what I spoke yesterday, the wandering practice of wandering. So I mentioned about the 4. As I mentioned, the 4 stages of the life. The last of them is called going forth. It's called samyasa, and wandering practitioner. So he went straight from living in the home to being a wandering practitioner, and he skipped the phase of living in the forest. He just went straight to become a wandering practitioner. Now, at that time, King Shuddhodana, the next morning, learned that Prince Siddhartha wasn't there, and he immediately sent a messenger to tell Prince Siddhartha to tell him to come back, but that didn't do any good. And they sent the messenger back, and he continued. He had completely made his decision entirely, and he wasn't going back. So then, where did he go? He went to Magadha. Now, the reason why he went to Magadha is that there were many excellent Dharma practitioners, many great Dharma practitioners. And so for that reason, he went to Magadha. Now, while he was on his way to Magadha, he went alone. He wasn't with anyone else. And when he went to the capital of Magadha, which is Rajgir. And when he went begging for alms in Rajgir, the king of Magadha, King Bimbisara, saw him and recognized him. I'm not getting this wrong, am I? I hope I'm not getting this wrong. So King Bimbisara saw him. And when he saw him, Bimbisara said to Prince Siddhartha, he gave him advice. You shouldn't think about going forth and become a monk. You should go back and listen to your father, he said. You have to become a king, he said. He gave him some advice about this. He gave him this advice, but Prince Siddhartha would not accept it. He didn't accept it. I think it was King Bimbisara who said that if I'm wrong, I will let you know. I will change this tomorrow. In any case, he didn't accept. Later, where Prince Siddhartha went is that there was a famous Dharma practitioner in Magadha whose name was Aladaka Lama. So he went to Aladaka Lama. So Alada wasn't just an ordinary Dharma practitioner. He practiced a samadhi, and he had achieved a very high level of samadhi. So the level that he got to is what we talk about. We talk about the four jhanas and the four formless, and so he got to the samadhi. He was a person who developed the samadhi of the third formless level of nothingness. And so what he taught the Prince Siddhartha was the technique of the samadhi of nothingness. Now, samadhi was very easy for Prince Siddhartha. And when he learned this, and so when he mastered the samadhi, he was not satisfied with it. He thought to himself, I can't achieve realize the nature from that. And so he went to look for another teacher. And who was that other teacher? Because Uddaka Ramaputra. So he went to Uddaka Ramaputra and he continued to practice. Now, Uddaka had developed an even higher level of meditation. So the previous one had achieved the level of nothingness. So Uddaka had an even more amazing samadhi called the samadhi of neither existence or non-existence. And so this is the highest of the four formless realms, the highest type of samadhi, the samadhi of neither existence nor non-existence. And so he had achieved that. And so his life was very, very peaceful. So the Siddhartha achieved it. He had an extremely peaceful mind, even more peaceful than mine before. He kind of sounded like he felt like his mind and the unchanging nature had kind of mixed into one flavor, like pouring water into water. I don't know whether it actually achieved one flavor, but it felt like it achieved one flavor. But Prince Siddhartha saw that there was a problem there. And the problem was that when he was meditating on samadhi, then his mind was extremely peaceful. But when he rose from the meditation, his mind moved exactly as it had before. And many thoughts occurred. And so for this reason, that this is just his mind becoming peaceful to the strength of samadhi, but it wasn't actually related to the nature of things. So training in samadhi does affect the mind. It does change the mind, but the nature of things has to come through realizing the nature, through reasonings. It has to come through the distinct, individually distinctive awareness. You can't just achieve liberation from samatha alone. So So even though he'd achieved that level of samadhi, he still had not fulfilled his aim of achieving liberation and liberating himself from samsara and realizing the nature of things. So he left. And so where did he go? So he was not the two great lamas, such great lamas, had not been able to fulfill his wishes. So it's like he had no place to go. So where did he go? So he went into the forest. He went into the forest and he practiced alone. So he practiced all alone, thinking to himself, I need to find a way to realize the nature. And he went alone and decided to go alone to the forest to practice meditation. And the forest that he went to was a forest near the so this is on the banks of the Naranjana River. There's a Uruvela forest. So this is a Naranjana. So it's like on the side. So there's a river and there was the forest. And so when he got there and he thought to himself, this is a very nice place to do practice. And so this is where he began to practice austerities. And he really went through a lot of austerities. It's austerities that, we can hardly conceive of the austerities that he did. Now, but this is a sort of a non-Buddhist way of practicing. And the way of practicing the asceticism, to give an example, I'm going to give two examples of this. The first is to stop the movement of breath and rest with the mind one-pointedly. So stopping the movement of breath means that normally when we breathe, we breathe through our mouth and nose, right? Either through our mouth or through our nostrils, right? When we breathe either through the nose or the mouth, right? But he stopped the moment of breath and rested with his mind one-pointedly. What he did, so this is what's similar to what we call in mantra is binding the prana. So what you have to do is you have to stop all the breath from moving so that you aren't breathing out at all. You have to completely stop it. And when you stopped it entirely, what happened is all the air came in through his ears. Now, I've never experienced this, but this is what they say. The air would come in through his ears, it said. So it's like as if, he couldn't breathe through his mouth and nose. So in the end, he had to breathing through his ears. And in the end, he even managed to stop the breath through his ears. And so when you stop the movement of all the breath and the winds, when you don't breathe, you die, right? But while suffering from such a medicine, he still was really diligent in trying to establish the firm foundation. He needed to have firm mindfulness. He had to cause the suffering of the body, but still within that, keep his mindfulness, keep his mind one-pointed and have a good firm foundation of mindfulness. And so what happened is that, so at the same time, and so he had to stop the breath, cause hardship for his body, and make sure that hardship of the body did not affect his mind from resting one-pointedly. And so he basically, he did this several times. If we say this, and if we don't say it respectfully, he was on the point of dying several times. That was one of his austerities that he practiced. Now, another way that he practiced, to give an example, was the austerity of food, which means not eating any food at all, not even any type of food at all. And so what he first did is, he decreased the amount of food that he was eating until he completely stopped eating or drinking at all. And so because he had stopped eating, had been fasting for so long, his body changed. His limbs became very, very thin, and all his skin started to hang. All the hair started falling out of his head. All the hair fell out of his head, and he's had an extreme physical suffering. I'll mention this later. There is the the story of the farmer's daughter who gave him yogurt. Some said it was milk, some say it was kir, but what she offered it to him, what it wrote there is what it says in the sutra. It said it was that it was and so at that time said that she thought it was the tree god, and when she saw him, because basically at that time she only saw the person. She didn't really see the person. She just suddenly looked kind of like it blended into the tree so perfectly that she thought that he was a tree god. And so he went through such extreme asceticism and austerities as that. And as he spent the time alone practicing austerities in the forest, what happened? When he's doing all the austerities, and he remembers the things that had happened in his life. You'll think of different things, right? For example, think about going home and doing as I did before. Think I could go back and live a luxurious life I did before. Maybe it's better. What I'm doing is pointless. So it's possible he would have had that sort of thought. It's possible that he might have had that sort of deceptive thought. And it's also possible that he'd had the doubt, now, by doing such austerities, am I going to possibly achieve liberation? And he was in the middle of a unpopulated forest. What there are birds, there are various beasts of prey, and they can go all around at will. They go back and forth. And in particular, in the middle of the night, there are all sorts of birds and beasts who are giving their calls. And whoever you are, you're going to get afraid sometimes, right? If you have to sit in the middle of a forest where there's no one around. He had all sorts of different thoughts and all these different fears. And so he took them as like a representative of the evil Mara. When we talk about a demon, a Mara, doesn't mean someone like with big fangs and a really scary person. That's not necessarily what's meant. At that point, a Mara, if we think about, when we talk the Mara, the demon is like a personification. But actually, that point is that the Prince Siddhartha at that point was having a lot of difficulties. And he was suffering from the asceticism. He was his body was suffering. He could have all sorts of different thoughts. He could have all sorts of fears. And so he explained these all as being like Maras or demons. In any case, all these different appearances and all these fears occur. And it's like, and so like they harassed him for not just for a single day, but for a long time. They just give him a hard time for many years. But he says the Maras didn't get even a single opportunity. He said, I won't give them a chance. He was going to keep practicing. And he just continued to practice. And there, the Maras were not able to get any chance. So basically, Prince Siddhartha was all as alone. He was completely solid. And he experienced such hardships as no one had ever experienced before. And not only did he face up to this, but he also, not just to facing up, that he also had to keep his mindfulness one pointedly. If you just are feeling suffering, you would just sort of put up with it, that's okay. But then he had an aim. There's a reason for doing austerities. And what is the reason for doing the austerities? It's to achieve to understand the nature of things. It wasn't just to do austerities, it was to realize the nature of things. And so for that reason, from the next aspect, he had a lot of difficulty in the mind. At the same time, he had to really maintain his mindfulness. So he tried in many different ways. In ways that just we can't get our minds around. He did these as he put all the work in, but he wasn't able to achieve the view or the state that transcended the world, the state, whether we call it the name of Buddhahood or Arhatship, the state that he wanted to achieve, the state and the view and level that he wanted to achieve, he did not achieve, even though he had done so much difficulty. So how is that achieved? How can you achieve a transcendent view or a transcendent state? How do you achieve that? And so that's what I'll speak about tomorrow. I won't speak about it tomorrow. Okay. So now we will have the closing prayers.